So let's kind of review briefly what we talked about on Friday. We were looking at our ADAS model, and we had real GDP or real output, whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter. We had our price level. We had aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. And we were at some full employment level of output, which we called YF, and we were at some price index, which we called 100, right? So here we were at some output level YF, we had some price index equal to, say, 100. And we said, okay, what happens if we have some increase in aggregate demand? So we saw aggregate demand increasing, and we see aggregate demand doing this. So we had some increase in output to, say, Y2, and we saw some increase in the price index to, say, 110. So in essence, what this was saying, you'll recall, is that we said, hey, on average, prices have gone up 10%. But remember that in the short run, these input prices are fixed. Therefore, input prices are staying the same, output prices are increasing, people's real wages are actually declining. And what we see happening is that firms respond to this by saying, we want to make more output, right? We're seeing profits increase. So they increase output. Out here to, say, Y2. But in order to do that, right, unemployment has to fall, employment rises. So we saw unemployment decreasing. We see employment increasing. Right, which makes sense if real wages are falling. Firms want to hire more people, not less. But eventually people get to the point where they say, look, you know, this stinks, my real wage has actually fallen, you have to give me a raise. And when they do that, we see the short-run aggregate supply curve actually begin to shift back in. To where we get to here, right? And so we saw that as people demand these higher wages, short-run aggregate supply curve decreases basically all the way back to essentially where it was before, right? So we have A, B, and C. And in terms of real output, what's the difference between point A and point C? Nothing. It's the same. Employment falls back to where it is. Normally, unemployment increases back to the natural rate of unemployment. The only thing that's different between point A and point C is what? Price level. Prices went up, right? It just takes more green pieces of paper to buy the same goods and services at C as it did at A. So let's see what happens if we have a decrease in aggregate demand. It's going to be very similar. But let's run through it anyway. So with this decrease, here's our real output. Here's our price level. So same thing as before. We start off at some full employment level of output YF. I'll just have our price index equal to be 100. It's just the easiest number, I think, for students to deal with. So we have this price index. Now we're going to see, for some reason, we're going to see a decrease in aggregate demand, right? There's a stock market crash, exchange rates change, foreign income falls, whatever it is. Whatever it is that's causing aggregate demand to decline, we're going to see this decline in aggregate demand. Okay? So let's look at what's happening here. Here we're seeing this decline in aggregate demand. The price index is falling. But remember, what's true about the input prices? They're staying the same, right? So here's what firms are seeing here. Here they're seeing output prices decline. They're seeing input prices stay the same. What are they seeing in terms of profits? Exactly. Here we're seeing profits actually decrease, right? So here we're seeing the price of tuition to Missouri State goes down, right? The price of everything else declines, but my wage is fixed under contract, right? And so they're going to have to pay me the same. So if tuition declines and my input prices stay the same, that's bad for them. And bad for all other firms too, right? What's happening to people's real wages? They've gone up, right? If input prices are staying the same and output prices are declining, real wages are actually increasing. And firms respond to that increase in the price of labor by doing the same thing that they do for everything. They use less of it, right? And so we see output begins to decline. We see unemployment increase. And we see employment decrease, right? So here we are at Y2, right? We're in a recession. Now you've got an excess supply of labor. Here you had essentially almost like a shortage, right? You can kind of think of it as people were working 60, 70 hours a week. Can't do that forever, but you can do it for some time. Here you've got an excess supply of labor. You've got a whole bunch of people that are unemployed, right? Real wages have gone up, but real wages have gone up for the people who still have their job. So you have all of these unemployed people here who are putting downward pressure on resource prices. They'll say, well, look, I mean, I used to have this job at 20 bucks an hour. I got laid off. I can't get the 20 bucks an hour, but 18, there's this job over here at 18. I'll take that. 18's better than nothing, all right? And so we see downward pressure on resource prices. This downward pressure on resource prices causes the short-run aggregate supply curve to increase. And when it increases, right, we see input prices continue to decline a little bit here, but the decline in input prices is larger. And so we kind of go once again from point A to B to C. So we return to C here. At this full employment level of output. Unemployment falls to this natural rate of unemployment. Employment rises. The only thing that's different is the price level falls to 80. Right. Takes fewer green pieces of paper to buy the same goods and services at C than it does at A. Now, how often do you see prices falling, generally? Pretty often or not very often? Not very often, right? So we can make this model more dynamic if we think of this not being as the price level, but the change in the price level. You see what I'm saying? So, and same thing for here, not output, but kind of like the change in output. So we're looking here at people's, not that the price level has gone up or that the price level has gone down, but the rate of inflation has gone up or the rate of inflation has gone down, right? We can make the models a little bit more interesting and a little bit more realistic, quote unquote, if we make them dynamic by looking at these changes, not the levels, right? So here you would have some, I mean, this could be anything, right? An inflation rate of 1%. Now you have an inflation rate of 0.8%, right? People have built into their expectations that prices are not going to increase. Inflation rate of 1%, inflation rate of 1.2%, et cetera. So we can make them more dynamic and more interesting if we want to, or you can choose to have them do this. It doesn't really matter. Let's look at changes in short-run aggregate supply. It's a little bit easier. So we've got the same thing here. We've got our full employment level of output. We're at, say, YF. We've got some price level. We're just going to call it, say, 100. And now we're going to see this decline in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So maybe this is due to, say, an oil embargo or something. Right? Basically, it now costs more to make goods and services. So we're going to see our short-run aggregate supply curve actually decrease. So I have this decline here to Y2. So we're going to see us going from point A here to B. So we're going from A to B, right? So we see here at B, employment falls. We've got this increase in the unemployment rate. We see output fall. Right? So we've got a lot of excess labor. But what's true about the price level? What did it do? It's gone up, right? With this price level increasing. So here we have both inflation and we have unemployment. It's not inflation because demand pull. It's cost push inflation. Here we're seeing people's real wages decline. So they should be wanting to hire more people, right? Yes, but they don't, right? Because there's been something that's changed, the fundamental relationship of, generally speaking, what it takes to make goods and services in the economy, right? We have this short-run aggregate supply shock. So real wages have declined, but at the same time, you've got unemployment has gone up. There should be a lot of this downward pressure on resource prices, and there is downward pressure on resource prices. But interestingly enough, unlike here, if you don't do anything, you'll just kind of stay here until whatever it was that caused the shock goes away, right? So if this is, say, an oil embargo, we'll stay there until the oil embargo is done or until people have reorganized capital and labor in such a way that oil is not as important anymore. So with these guys over here, you're kind of going from A to B to C, right? And same thing over here, you're kind of going from A to B to C. Here, interestingly enough, we're going from A to B, and then we stay there until whatever it was that caused us to move from A to B is done or goes away. Now we'll see when we start talking about fiscal policy that there is a way to change that. We could go from B to some other place. What could we do if we want to return the economy to full employment? What could we change? Yeah, we could do this, right? Don't draw this on your thing because we'll draw it later. We could do this. Oops, wrong direction. Right? I mean, that's an option is what I'm saying. But doing that returns you to full employment, but it also increases the price level, right? And remember, like I said, if we think of this model dynamically, as that not that this is the price level, but this is more like inflation, then we've just gone permanently from one rate of inflation to a much higher rate of inflation, whatever this guy up here is, 120 or whatever he is. A higher rate of, the prices are increasing faster. Similarly, if you have an increase in your short-run aggregate supply curve, it's the exact same thing. You've got real output, you've got the price level. Aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply curve. Here you are at, say, YF. Here you are at 100, right? Same thing as before. You've got some increase in short-run aggregate supply, some kind of something that causes short-run aggregate supply curve to increase. Come out here to say Y2, doing so at some lower price level. Same thing as before, right? Here you're seeing output increase, You're seeing employment increase, unemployment fall, real wages go up, right? And you'll kind of stay there until whatever it was that caused the short-run aggregate supply curve to increase is done. So here, once again, we kind of go like this. We kind of go to here, right? And then whatever it was that caused the short-run aggregate supply curve to increase is finished, we move basically back to point A. Alternatively, rather than going back to this higher price level, we could, if we wanted to, because you know you're going to return to YF at some point in time anyway, you could do what? You could lower aggregate demand somehow. I'm not saying you have to, I'm saying you could. Return to full employment level, which you're going to anyway, except now do so at a lower price level. Or if you make the model dynamic. You know what I mean by dynamic, right? Changing over time. This is a static model, right? Price level is static. The change in the price level, though, is dynamic. So now we have this same return to our full employment level of output, except we're doing so at a lower price level, or if we make the model dynamic at a lower rate of inflation. Let's look at our changes in long run. Because remember, when we said the long run changes, it brings the short run with it. So here's our real output. There's our price level. Here's aggregate demand. Short-run aggregate supply. Long-run aggregate supply. So here we are at some point in level. Say YF. Some price level, say 100. And now we're going to see this change in long-run aggregate supply. Remember, what was changing long-run aggregate supply? The quantity of our resources, quality of our resources, or our level of technology. And we said to a different extent the social and legal structure that we have. Right? Because lots of countries might have the same levels of resources and the same quantity and quality and the same technologies, but they may not be able to produce goods and services in such a way, especially if their cultures are different in terms of work ethic or corruption or other types of factors like that. So we're going to have a change in one of these things. Right? We know that the long-run aggregate supply curve is going to increase. And remember, the short run is really just a special case of the long run. And so it brings the short run with it. And so we have this increase. I'm going to call this YF2. We see that output increases. But which type of output increases? Our real output, or our, what do we call this guy? Our full employment level of output, right? So our full employment level of output's actually going up. Our ability to make goods and services using all of our resources is increasing, right? So we're seeing this increase in our full employment level of output, right? We're seeing output increase. From YF to Y2. Similarly, you're seeing the price level fall. Or, like I said, if you want to make the model dynamic, and you want to look at changes in real output and changes in the price level, then you're looking at the rate of inflation declining. But what's this guy going to do over time, typically? Aggregate demand. He's going to increase as well, right? So you'll recall what we have observed so far. We've seen these increases in output, right? I mean, we make a whole lot more stuff today than we did 20 years ago. But what do we generally see about the price level? Are the price levels lower today? No. All right. So here's what we typically see happening. We're seeing aggregate, or we're seeing our long run aggregate supply curve increase. But at the same time, we're also seeing our aggregate demand increase, right? I mean, there's more people in the country. There's more. The countries are richer, etc. Right. So we have some full employment level of output, we have some price level. And typically what we've been seeing happening, we saw this when we were talking about the business cycle, right, where we had time here and we had real output. Right, we tended to see something kind of like this with this trend line that we had here. Here is our real output. And that's essentially what we're seeing over here, right? We're seeing these increases in our long run aggregate supply curve over time. Every time the long run moves, it brings the short run with it. Right? But at the same time, aggregate demand is also increasing. And so we're seeing increases in output and increases in the price level at the same time, which is exactly what we see. Right? Very, very similar to this guy over here. So recall this business cycle model said, look, we're going to see changes in output. We're going to see some periods where on trend, it's growing faster than this line, right? That's what this line is here. This is some trend. The slope of this line at different points is the rate of change. It's how fast something is changing or growing or declining, right? And so you've got periods, some here, where it's going up really fast, say in here, you've got other periods where it's not growing as fast in here. You've got some periods where it's not growing at all, like say here. You've got periods where it's declining. You've got periods where it's declining quickly. But generally speaking, things are returning to this long-run trend, which is exactly what we see happening here, right? Hey, decline in short-run aggregate supply curve. Output declines. Output declines. But whenever what it was that made this guy occur is done, we come back, right? Come back to our trend. That's us doing this guy. This guy right here going to like this, is this occurring? Boom. And then whenever whatever it was that caused the short-run aggregate supply curve to decline is done, we start growing again, right? That's what happens when you start coming this way. Same thing over here, right? You've got periods where you're growing faster, and then whenever what it is done, well, it starts to decline, right? Real output's decreasing. Long-run trend, right? Long-run trend. All right, remember we said for most of the 20th century this guy was about 3%. Now we're wondering, is he maybe 2%? I don't know. We'll have to see. But our real business cycle model over here said we're going to see these ups and downs in the economy. We're going to see periods where it's increasing. We're going to see periods where it's decreasing. We've got this general long-run trend that's going up at some point, 2%, 3%, 1%, 4%, 12%, whatever the number is. You guys do understand that for most of human history, it was this, right? At some really low level of output, whatever that level of output was. This is a relatively new phenomenon. By relatively new, I mean last 300-400 years, right? For most of human history, you had this. Last 300-400 years, it's been doing that. Questions on the ADAS model? Once again, this is the simple model. Did you write that down? This is the simple model?
No, I do a really ugly graph. It doesn't make any sense when I look at it. I put too many arrows.
I know. That's what I said. This is the simple model. What's going to be really interesting is when you look at the Keynesian model in this framework. It's alphabet soup. It's A-E, blah, blah. Right? That's the way it's going to be. Trust me, I've been doing this for 20 years. Questions on the ADAS model? Yes?
Okay, maybe this is a dumb question, but on these two over here where you're talking about bringing up or bringing down the demand, how would you do that in the real world?
So that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy, because that's a very good question. Fiscal policy is going to be changes in taxes or changes in government spending. Monetary policy is going to be changes in the money supply. So to give you kind of a hint of what's coming, when you're talking about monetary policy, well, how would changes in the money supply have an impact? Well, it changes the interest rate. And it says, oh, okay. Well, it makes a whole lot of sense to borrow money now because interest rates are really, 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 really low. Or the exact opposite. Interest rates are really, really high. It doesn't make sense to borrow money. Changes in taxes and changes in government spending are also pretty obvious, right? If your taxes go up and the government doesn't give you more goods and services for that, you have less stuff. Similarly, if taxes go down and the government doesn't change the amount of services that they give, then you have more money in your pocket, right? So you can change people's wealth by changing their taxes or by changing the services that they're getting in exchange. So, in other words, the reason that we have these two different models is because we got to this model where you're at this point right here. And remember what we said. We said eventually, whatever it was that caused the short-run aggregate supply curve to decline is done, then we'll move back to A, right? And that will eventually happen. It really will. It might take a long time, but you really will get back to A at some point in time. You will. Keynes comes along and says, famously, in the long run, we're all dead. In other words, yes, eventually we'll get back to A, but why wait? Why not go ahead and do something, change aggregate demand, and get you here to C, because there's really no difference between A and C anyway, other than the number of green pieces of paper it takes to buy the goods and services. And people say, yeah, that sounds pretty good, let's do that. And so people did that. And then they said, the Keynesian model has problems too. It doesn't work perfectly either. So that's why we have these changes in aggregate demand. I mean, that's why I have these guys kind of dotted, right? You could do these, but you don't have to. Whatever it was that caused this guy to increase is done, you'll go back to A. Whenever it was that caused this guy to move here is done, you'll go back to A. But that could take a long time, right? The oil embargo, the 70s are not known as periods of fantastic economic growth. In fact, they're known as periods of stagflation, right? High inflation, high unemployment. The economy is stagnated. And the Keynesian model says you can't have stagflation. But we had stagflation. Under the Keynesian model, this is not possible. But it is. People are like, but it's happening. So clearly, the Keynesian model doesn't work perfectly either. So like I said, we'll get to that when we look at fiscal and monetary policy. Okay. So I will see you guys on Wednesday when we have the exam.